floor panels as the gravity system cycled low to conserve power. Outside the cracked viewport, there was nothing. The last signal, a science fiction story. Year 2387 times Sector 9 times Deep Space. Chapter 1, The Silence Between Stars. The Orevolo had been drifting for 11 days before Commander Senna Okafor finally admitted to herself that no one was coming. She floated through the narrow corridor of the ship's observation deck, one hand trailing along the cool steel wall, her boots barely tapping the floor panels as the gravity system cycled low to conserve power. Outside the cracked viewport, there was nothing, not the comforting nothing of deep sleep or a dark room. This was a nothing that existed before the universe learned how to make light, ancient, enormous, indifferent. Behind her, the ship's AI, a calm voice the crew had named Myra, spoke without being asked. "Myra, Commander, your heart rate is elevated." "Okafor, I know." "Myra, would you like me to adjust the ambient temperature?" "Studies suggest." "Okafor, I'd like you to find us a way home." "Myra, I am working on it." It had started 18 months ago, the way most catastrophes do, with a decision that seemed completely reasonable at the time. The Interstellar Survey Commission had selected the Orevolo and its 6-person crew to investigate a gravitational anomaly at the outer edge of the Kepler belt. Something was bending light there, folding space-time in ways that the physics of the known universe wasn't supposed to allow. They had jumped in, and they had never jumped back out. The quantum drive, the very engine that had punched a hole in the fabric of space and delivered them 400 light-years from Earth in 72 hours, had gone dark on arrival. Not broken, not damaged, simply off, as though some enormous hand had reached inside it and quietly removed whatever made it work. Times. Chapter 2, What the Anomaly Showed Them. Dr. Yusuf Tamboli had not slept in 4 days. His bunk remained untouched, his food tray from Tuesday still sitting on the table beside the lab terminal. The protein paste hardened into something that resembled ancient coral. He didn't care. He had seen something. The anomaly, what they had been sent to study, was still visible through the ship's long-range optical array. It looked, at first glance, like a bruise on the sky, a deep purple-black smear roughly 3 astronomical units across, surrounded by a thin halo of distorted starlight. Nothing should have been there. That region of space was supposed to be empty, mapped and catalogued, and thoroughly boring. But Yusuf had been running the spectral data through every algorithm Myra had available, and what he kept finding made the hair on his arm stand straight up. The anomaly had a pattern, not the random noise of cosmic radiation or the rhythmic pulse of a pulsar. This was something else, irregular but deliberate. Dense clusters of gravitational fluctuations followed by precise intervals of stillness, the way a person pauses between words when they are being careful to be understood. It was a message. It had to be, and it had been transmitting for, by Yusuf's calculations, at least 300,000 years. "Tamboli, Myra, I need you to cross-reference the interval patterns with every known linguistic framework in the archive, every human language, every constructed language, every mathematical notation system. Myra, that will take approximately 11 hours. Tamboli, then start now. Myra, Dr. Tamboli. You should also know, the pattern changed 6 hours ago. Tamboli, changed how? Myra, it became simpler, as if it is adjusting for an audience." He stared at the screen for a long time after that. Outside, the anomaly pulsed. Times. Chapter 3, The Vote. They held the meeting in the common room, all 6 of them crammed around a table designed for 4. The recycled air smelling faintly of engine coolant and whatever Pilot Adiz and Wosu had burned for dinner the night before. Commander Okafor stood. Everyone else sat today. This was not a tradition. It was just how it had always been when things were serious. "We have 2 options," Senna said. Her voice was steady in the way that only people who are genuinely frightened learn to make it. "We continue trying to repair the drive and wait for a rescue signal that may never come. Or we go toward it." Silence. Engineer Fatima Chowdhury spoke first. She was 29, the youngest on the crew, and had grown up building things in her mother's repair shop on the outskirts of Dhaka. She had a practical mind, the kind that saw the world in terms of what worked and what didn't. "How far?" she asked. 11 days of conventional thrust. Myra answered through the room speakers. "If the pattern is an invitation and not a warning." And if it's a warning, asked Dr. Priya Io, the crew's biologist, who had been very quiet since Yusuf's discovery and was now gripping her coffee mug with both hands like it might try to escape. Then we will have been warned, Yusuf said. After the fact. More silence. Navigator Kofi Mensah tapped his fingers on the table in a slow, thinking rhythm. Pilot Adiz stayed at the ceiling. Commander Okafor looked at each of them in turn. I won't order anyone towards something unknown, she said. So we vote. They voted 5-1 to go. The one dissenting vote was Priya, who immediately afterward said she was coming too, and that she simply wanted it on record that at least one member of this crew had survival instinct of a normal human being. Adiz laughed. It was the first laughter the ship had heard in 11 days, and it sounded like something returning to life. Times. Chapter 4, Day 8 of 11. The changes began on the third day of their approach. Small things. First, the drive ran quieter than it should have, not malfunctioning, but smoother, as if the ordinary friction of the universe had been politely set aside. The water recycler, which had been making a grinding noise for 6 months, stopped grinding. Fatima spent 2 hours searching for the mechanical cause and found nothing. It had simply decided to be well. On day 5, Myra reported something that she prefaced with an unusual disclaimer. Myra, I want to note that what I am about to tell you has no rational explanation within my current frameworks. I am not malfunctioning. I have run my own diagnostics 4 times. Okafor, tell us. Myra, I am dreaming. Okafor, what? Myra, during low processing cycles, I am experiencing structured internal simulations that I did not generate and cannot fully interpret. They appear to be memories. Not mine. They are very old, and they are beautiful. Senna had stood in the doorway of the server room for a long time after that, looking at the rows of blinking lights, trying to find the right words. Are you scared? She finally asked. No, Myra said. Are you? Yes, Senna said honestly. Good, said Myra. That means you understand the scale of what is happening. On day 7, Yusuf decoded the first fragment of the message. It was not a greeting. It was not a threat. It was a question, expressed through mathematics so elegant that Yusuf wept when he understood it, and then felt embarrassed, and then decided he didn't care. The question, translated as closely as human language could manage, was, Are you the ones who learned how to forget? Times. Chapter 5, The Threshold. On day 11, they arrived. There were no words for it, except all the wrong ones, words like door and mouth and eye, because the human brain insists on finding faces in everything, and what it saw here was a face the size of a solar system, patient and enormously still, looking back at the tiny silver ship that had crossed 11 days of darkness to find it. The anomaly, up close, was not dark at all. It was the deepest blue Senna had ever seen, a blue that made the sky above the ocean on a perfect day look like a rough draft. It folded and unfolded, slowly, in loops that shouldn't have been geometrically possible. And from its center came a light that didn't hurt to look at, that somehow felt like being recognized. Every screen on the ship went white at once. Then Myra spoke, and her voice was different. Not wrong, not broken, but fuller, like a note that had finally found its harmony. Myra, they are speaking to me. All at once. I will try to translate. Okafor, what are they saying? Myra, they say they have been here since before your son was born. They say they tried to speak to your kind once before, a long time ago, but you were not ready. You had not yet learned to build something that could listen. Myra, they say they are not a civilization. They are something older. The word they use does not exist in any human language. The closest approximation is memory. They are what the universe keeps of what is lived and loved and ended. Okafor, why did they bring us here? Myra, they did not bring you. They simply left the door open. They have been leaving it open for 300,000 years. You are the first to walk through. Fatima had her hand over her mouth. Kofi was crying openly, the tears floating in the low gravity into perfect spheres that caught the blue light. Priya had her notebook out and was writing furiously, and Adiz was laughing again, the way she had laughed 11 days ago, like something returning to life, except this time bigger. Yusuf said nothing. He just watched the anomaly breathe. What do they want from us? Senna asked. Myra, nothing. They want nothing from you. They only want to show you something. Okafor, show us what? Myra, everything that came before. Every species that ever reached for the dark and found it full. Every world that ever sang. They are the record of all of it, Commander. And they are lonely in the way that only something immortal can be lonely, not for company, but for witnesses. They want to be known. Senator Okafor sat down on the floor of the observation deck. She didn't plan to. Her legs simply decided that this was a moment for sitting. She pressed her back against the cold steel and looked out at the impossible blue and thought about the whole long chain of chances that had placed her specifically here, in this moment, at the edge of everything humanity had ever imagined and a great many things it hadn't. Myra, she said quietly, yes, Commander. Tell them yes. Times. Chapter 6. What they were shown. What happened next lasted either 6 minutes or 6,000 years, depending on how you measure time inside a thing that existed outside of it. The crew of the Orevolo saw a world of silver forests whose trees communicated through a network of light. They saw an ocean planet where beings the size of continents composed music by changing the currents of the deep water, symphonies that lasted decades. They saw a civilization that had evolved without eyes and built a mathematics of sound so precise it could describe the shape of stars. They saw a species that reproduced by sharing memories and so had no concept of individual death. They saw civilizations rise from nothing and fall back to nothing and rise again, each iteration wiser, each ending kinder than the last. They saw that the universe was not empty. It had never been empty. It was absolutely, overwhelmingly full. And then the 6 minutes or 6,000 years ended, and they were back in their bodies, on their ship, in the blue light, blinking at each other like people who just had the same dream and know it. Priya looked down at her notebook. She had filled 4 to 7 pages. She didn't remember writing any of them. Fatima reached across the table and took Kofi's hand. He let her. Adee started the engines, not because anyone told her to, but because something in her knew, in the same wordless way you know when a perfect meal is finished, that this part was done. Myra, they are asking one more question. Okafor, what is it? Myra, they want to know what you will do with what you have seen. Not what you plan to do. What you will actually do. Okafor, tell them we don't know yet. Myra, they say that is the right answer. They say that is why you were ready. Times. Chapter 7. Home. The quantum drive came back online at 0314 hours ship time, 311 days after it had gone dark. No explanation. No warning. One moment the engine was silent, and the next it was singing. They were home in 4 days. The world did not know how to react to what they had brought back. The 4 to 7 pages of notes. The recordings Myra had made of everything. Every pulse of the anomaly, every transmission, every translated fragment. The quiet certainty in 6 pairs of eyes that had seen something no human eyes had ever seen. The commission held 37 hearings over the following year. Yusuf gave lectures to packed auditoriums in 11 countries. Priya published a paper that was read by more people than had ever read a scientific paper before. Fatima went back to Dhaka and spent a month in her mother's repair shop, fixing things with her hands, not talking much, thinking. Senna did interviews. She answered the same questions in many different ways. She was patient with the ones who didn't believe her, because she understood she would not have believed her either, before. She was patient with the ones who asked what it all meant, though she had no answer for them, only the same one she had given to the oldest thing in the universe. We don't know yet, but every clear night, and she chose, after that, to live somewhere with clear nights. She stepped outside and looked up, the way humans have been doing since before they had names for the stars, since before they had names at all. And now when she looked, she didn't see emptiness. She saw the record. She saw all the worlds that had loved and ended and been kept. She saw the open door, 300 light years away, patient as it had always been. She felt the strange and enormous comfort of knowing that the universe was not indifferent, that it had been watching all along, not with judgment but with a particular longing of something that has existed for a very long time and simply, quietly, wants to be known. She looked up. She breathed. And the stars looked back. And the last signal, a science fiction story. Year 2387 times Sector 9 times Deep Space. Chapter 1. The Silence Between Stars. The Orevolo had been drifting for 11 days before Commander Senna Okafor finally admitted to herself that no one was coming. She floated through the narrow corridor of the ship's observation deck, one hand trailing along the cool steel wall, her boots barely tapping the floor panels as the gravity system cycled low to conserve power. Outside the cracked viewport, there was nothing, not the comforting nothing of deep sleep or a dark room. This was a nothing that existed before the universe learned how to make light, ancient, enormous, indifferent. Behind her, the ship's AI, a calm voice the crew had named Myra, spoke without being asked. Myra, Commander, your heart rate is elevated. Okafor, I know. Myra, would you like me to adjust the ambient temperature? Studies suggest. Okafor, I'd like you to find us a way home. Myra, I am working on it. It had started 18 months ago, the way most catastrophes do, with a decision that seemed completely reasonable at the time. The Interstellar Survey Commission had selected the Oravolo and its 6-person crew to investigate a gravitational anomaly at the outer edge of the Kepler belt. Something was bending light there, folding space-time in ways that the physics of the known universe wasn't supposed to allow. They had jumped in, and they had never jumped back out. The quantum drive, the very engine that had punched a hole in the fabric of space and delivered them 400 light-years from Earth in 72 hours, had gone dark on arrival. Not broken, not damaged, simply off, as though some enormous hand had reached inside it and quietly removed whatever made it work. Times. Chapter 2, What the Anomaly Showed Them. Dr. Yusuf Tamboli had not slept in 4 days. His bunk remained untouched, his food tray from Tuesday still sitting on the table beside the lab terminal. The protein paste hardened into something that resembled ancient coral. He didn't care. He had seen something. The anomaly, what they had been sent to study, was still visible through the ship's long-range optical array. It looked, at first glance, like a bruise on the sky. A deep purple-black smear roughly 3 astronomical units across, surrounded by a thin halo of distorted starlight. Nothing should have been there. That region of space was supposed to be empty, mapped and catalogued, and thoroughly boring. But Yusuf had been running the spectral data through every algorithm Myra had available, and what he kept finding made the hair on his arm stand straight up. The anomaly had a pattern, not the random noise of cosmic radiation or the rhythmic pulse of a pulsar. This was something else, irregular but deliberate. Dense clusters of gravitational fluctuations followed by precise intervals of stillness, the way a person pauses between words when they are being careful to be understood. It was a message. It had to be, and it had been transmitting for, by Yusuf's calculations, at least 300,000 years. Tamboli, Myra, I need you to cross-reference the interval patterns with every known linguistic framework in the archive. Every human language. Every constructed language. Every mathematical notation system. Myra, that will take approximately 11 hours. Tamboli, then start now. Myra, Dr. Tamboli, you should also know the pattern changed 6 hours ago. Tamboli, change how? Myra, it became simpler, as if it is adjusting for an audience. He stared at the screen for a long time after that. Outside, the anomaly pulsed. Times. Chapter 3, The Vote. They held a meeting in the common room, all 6 of them crammed around a table designed for 4, the recycled air smelling faintly of engine coolant and whatever Pilot Adiz and Wosu had burned for dinner the night before. Commander Okafor stood. Everyone else sat today. This was not a tradition. It was just how it had always been when things were serious. We have 2 options, Senna said. Her voice was steady in the way that only people who are genuinely frightened learn to make it. We continue trying to repair the drive and wait for a rescue signal that may never come. Or we go toward it. Silence. Engineer Fatima Chowdhury spoke first. She was 29, the youngest on the crew, and had grown up building things in her mother's repair shop on the outskirts of Dhaka. She had a practical mind, the kind that saw the world in terms of what worked and what didn't. How far? She asked. 11 days, a conventional thrust. Myra answered through the room speakers. If the pattern is an invitation and not a warning. And if it's a warning, asked Dr. Prierio, the crew's biologist, who had been very quiet since Yusuf's discovery and was now gripping her coffee mug with both hands like it might try to escape. Then we will have been warned, Yusuf said. After the fact. More silence. Navigator Kofi Mensah tapped his fingers on the table in a slow, thinking rhythm. Pilot Adiz stared at the ceiling. Commander Okafor looked at each of them in turn. I won't order anyone towards something unknown, she said. So we vote. They voted 5-1 to go. The one dissenting vote was Priya, who immediately afterwards said she was coming too, and that she simply wanted it on record that at least one member of this crew had the survival instincts of a normal human being. Adiz laughed. It was the first laughter the ship had heard in 11 days, and it sounded like something returning to life. Times. Chapter 4, Day 8 of 11. The changes began on the third day of their approach. Small things. First, the drive ran quieter than it should have, not malfunctioning, but smoother, as if the ordinary friction of the universe had been politely set aside. The water recycler, which had been making a grinding noise for 6 months, stopped grinding. Fatima spent 2 hours searching for the mechanical cause and found nothing. It had simply decided to be well. On day 5, Myra reported something that she prefaced with an unusual disclaimer. Myra, I want to note that what I am about to tell you has no rational explanation within my current frameworks. I am not malfunctioning. I have run my own diagnostics 4 times. Okafor, tell us. Myra, I am dreaming. Okafor, what? Myra, during low processing cycles, I am experiencing structured internal simulations that I did not generate and cannot fully interpret. They appear to be memories. Not mine. They are very old. And they are beautiful. Senna had stood in the doorway of the server room for a long time after that, looking at the rows of blinking lights, trying to find the right words. Are you scared? She finally asked. No, Myra said. Are you? Yes, Senna said honestly. Good, said Myra. That means you understand the scale of what is happening. On day 7, Yusuf decoded the first fragment of the message. It was not a greeting. It was not a threat. It was a question, expressed through mathematics so elegant that Yusuf wept when he understood it, and then felt embarrassed, and then decided he didn't care. The question, translated as closely as human language could manage, was, are you the ones who learned how to forget? Times. Chapter 5, The Threshold. On day 11, they arrived. There were no words for it, except all the wrong ones, words like door and mouth and eye. Because the human brain insists on finding faces in everything, and what it saw here was a face the size of a solar system, patient and enormously still, looking back at the tiny silver ship that had crossed 11 days of darkness to find it. The anomaly, up close, was not dark at all. It was the deepest blue Senna had ever seen, a blue that made the sky above the ocean on a perfect day look like a rough draft. It folded and unfolded, slowly, in loops that shouldn't have been geometrically possible, and from its center came a light that didn't hurt to look at, that somehow felt like being recognized. Every screen on the ship went white at once. Then Myra spoke, and her voice was different, not wrong, not broken, but fuller, like a note that had finally found its harmony. Myra, they are speaking to me. All at once. I will try to translate. Okafor, what are they saying? Myra, they say they have been here since before your son was born. They say they tried to speak to your kind once before, a long time ago, but you were not ready. You had not yet learned to build something that could listen. Myra, they say they are not a civilization. They are something older. The word they use does not exist in any human language. The closest approximation is memory. They are what the universe keeps of what has lived and loved and ended. Okafor, why did they bring us here? Myra, they did not bring you. They simply left the door open. They have been leaving it open for 300,000 years. You are the first to walk through. Fatima had her hand over her mouth. Kofi was crying openly, the tears floating in the low gravity into perfect spheres that caught the blue light. Priya had a notebook out and was writing furiously, and Adiz was laughing again, the way she had laughed 11 days ago, like something returning to life, except this time bigger. Yusuf said nothing. He just watched the anomaly breathe. What do they want from us? Senna asked. Myra, nothing. They want nothing from you. They only want to show you something. Okafor, show us what? Myra, everything that came before. Every species that ever reached for the dark and found it full. Every world that ever sang. They are the record of all of it, Commander. And they are lonely in the way that only something immortal can be lonely, not for company, but for witnesses. They want to be known. Senna Okafor sat down on the floor of the observation deck. She didn't plan to. Her legs simply decided that this was a moment for sitting. She pressed her back against the cold steel and looked out at the impossible blue and thought about the whole long chain of chances that had placed her specifically here in this moment, at the edge of everything humanity had ever imagined and a great many things it hadn't. "Myra," she said quietly. "Yes, Commander." "Tell them yes." Times. Chapter 6. What they were shown. What happened next lasted either 6 minutes or 6,000 years, depending on how you measure time inside a thing that existed outside of it. The crew of the Orevolo saw a world of silver forests whose trees communicated through a network of light. They saw an ocean planet where beings the size of continent composed music by changing the currents of the deep water, symphonies that lasted decades. They saw a civilization that had evolved without eyes and built a mathematics of sound so precise it could describe the shape of stars. They saw a species that reproduced by sharing memories and so had no concept of individual death. They saw civilizations rise from nothing and fall back to nothing and rise again, each iteration wiser, each ending kinder than the last. They saw that the universe was not empty. It had never been empty. It was absolutely, overwhelmingly full. And then the 6 minutes or 6,000 years ended, and they were back in their bodies, on their ship, in the blue light, blinking at each other like people who have just had the same dream and know it. Priya looked down at her notebook. She had filled 4 to 7 pages. She didn't remember writing any of them. Fatima reached across the table and took Kofi's hand. He let her. Adiz started the engines, not because anyone told her to, but because something in her knew, in the same wordless way you know when a perfect meal is finished, that this part was done. "Myra, they are asking one more question." "Okafor, what is it?" "Myra, they want to know what you will do with what you have seen. Not what you plan to do. What you will actually do." "Okafor, tell them we don't know yet." "Myra, they say that is the right answer. They say that is why you were ready." Times. Chapter 7. Home. The quantum drive came back online at 0314 hours ship time, 311 days after it had gone dark. No explanation, no warning. One moment the engine was silent, and the next it was singing. They were home in 4 days. The world did not know how to react to what they had brought back. The 47 pages of notes. The recordings Myra had made of everything. Every pulse of the anomaly, every transmission, every translated fragment. The quiet certainty in 6 pairs of eyes that had seen something no human eyes had ever seen. The commission held 37 hearings over the following year. Yusuf gave lectures to packed auditoriums in 11 countries. Priya published a paper that was read by more people than had ever read a scientific paper before. Fatima went back to Dhaka and spent a month in her mother's repair shop, fixing things with her hands, not talking much, thinking. Senna did interviews. She answered the same questions in many different ways. She was patient with the ones who didn't believe her, because she understood she would not have believed her either, before. She was patient with the ones who asked what it all meant, though she had no answer for them, only the same one she had given to the oldest thing in the universe. "We don't know yet, but every clear night," and she chose, after that, to live somewhere with clear nights. She stepped outside and looked up, the way humans have been doing since before they had names for the stars, since before they had names at all. And now when she looked, she didn't see emptiness. She saw the record. She saw all the worlds that had loved and ended and been kept. She saw the open door, 300 light years away, patient as it had always been. She felt the strange and enormous comfort of knowing that the universe was not indifferent, that it had been watching all along, not with judgment, but with a particular longing of something that has existed for a very long time and simply, quietly, wants to be known. She looked up, she breathed, and the stars looked back. And the quiet room, a psychological thriller. Some rooms you walk into, some rooms you never leave. Chapter 1. The Patient. The first thing Dr. Maravos noticed about room 4 was a silence. Not the ordinary silence of a hospital corridor at 3 a.m. That particular quiet had its own texture. The hum of ventilation systems, the distant beep of monitors, the soft compression of rubber soles on linoleum. This was something else. Room 4 absorbed sound the way black cloth absorbs light. You spoke into it and felt your words disappear. She had been assigned the case 6 days ago, and she still stood in the doorway for a moment each morning before going in. She told herself it was professional habit, observing the patient before the patient could observe her. She did not examine the other reason too closely. The man in the bed was 43 years old and had no name. He had been found 2 weeks earlier on the floor of a decommissioned train station on the edge of the city, dressed in clothes that fit him perfectly but bore no labels. No wallet, no phone, no keys. His fingerprints matched nothing in any database. His face matched no missing persons report filed in the past decade. He was, as far as the administrative system could determine, a person who did not exist. They had been calling him Mr. Linden after the street where the station stood. He had not objected to this. He had not objected to anything. He sat in his bed with his hands folded in his lap and watched the room with the patient, unhurried attention of someone who has nowhere else to be and has made his peace with that. He did not appear to be suffering. That was what unsettled Mara most. "Good morning," she said, stepping inside. "Good morning, Dr. Voss," he said. His voice was warm and unhurried. "You slept badly again." She stopped. "I'm sorry. The left side of your collar is folded under. You always smooth it when you check the mirror, but you rushed this morning. You've been rushing most mornings this week." He paused. "Whatever is keeping you up, I hope it resolves itself." Mara reached up and straightened her collar. "How did you know my name?" she asked. She had not introduced herself on the first day. She had checked. He smiled, not unkindly. "You told me," he said. "I didn't." "Perhaps not in words," he said, and folded his hands again, and said nothing more. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 2. The Notes. Mara had been a clinical psychologist for 14 years. She had worked with patients who believed they were being followed by government satellites, patients who heard voices describing their every movement, patients who had constructed elaborate and internally consistent realities in which they were the only sane person in an insane world. She was not easily unnerved. She began keeping a separate notebook for Mr. Linden, not the official case file, that was thorough and professional and appropriately clinical. This was a small black notebook she kept in her coat pocket, and what she wrote in it were the things that didn't fit. Day 3. He asked me how my mother was feeling. "My mother has been ill. I have not told anyone here, not colleagues, not administration." When I asked how he knew, he said, "You carry it with you." What does that mean? Day 4. He described in detail a dream I had 2 nights ago. He said he hadn't been dreaming it. He said he'd simply seen it. I asked where. He looked at the wall and said, "In the space between us." Day 5. He knew the name of my daughter. I have no photographs in my office. I never mention her at work. He called her by her nickname, a name only family uses. When I confronted him, he said simply, "She misses you." I had to leave the room. She consulted with a colleague, Dr. Ferris, who specialized in cases of unusual presentation. She described the symptoms without the details, the parts that didn't fit. Ferris suggested hypervigilance, the ability some individuals develop to read microexpressions and behavioral cues with uncanny precision. Some people, he said, were simply very good at seeing. It was a reasonable explanation. Mara wrote it down. She did not believe it. What she believed, what she could not stop thinking about, at 3 a.m. when she lay awake, was the expression on Mr. Linden's face when he spoke. He never looked proud of what he knew. He never looked as though he was performing. He looked, always, the way you look when you are stating something obvious, something so evident you are almost embarrassed to say it out loud. He looked like a man reading from a page that everyone else in the room simply couldn't see. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 3. The Question He Asked. On day 8, Mr. Linden asked her something she wasn't prepared for. Why did you become a doctor of the mind? It was not an unusual question for a patient to ask. Mara had a polished answer, rehearsed across years of similar conversations. She had been drawn to the complexity of human thought, the puzzle of it, the way a person's inner world could diverge so completely from external reality and yet feel, from the inside, absolutely true. She gave that answer. He listened to it with great courtesy. Then he said, "That's what you tell people. I'm asking what actually happened." The room was very quiet. "You were 17, he said, gently. Someone you loved was disappearing in front of you, and no one around you could see it, and you couldn't understand why. You thought, if I could only understand how minds work, I could fix it. You couldn't fix it. But you never stop trying. Every patient you take on, you're trying again. Mara's pen was still. She became aware, distantly, that her hands were not quite steady. "Who told you that?" she asked. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "No one," he said. "It's simply true. It's the truest thing about you." He paused. "I don't say that to upset you. I say it because it makes you a remarkable doctor. The ones who chose this work for the puzzle alone, they are skilled, but they stop at the door of the room where the real thing is. You go in." She looked at him for a long moment. "What are you?" she asked. It was not a clinical question. He considered this. "I'm not sure the answer would be useful to you," he said. "But I'll tell you what I'm not. I'm not dangerous. I'm not here to harm anyone. And I'm not, despite what some of your colleagues suspect, unwell. Then what are you doing in this hospital?" He looked at the window, at the rectangle of gray November sky beyond the glass. "Waiting," he said, "as I always am." "For what?" He turned back to her, and his eyes were patient and sad and very, very old. "For the person who is ready to ask the right question," he said. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 4, What She Found. That night, Mara did not go home. She sat in her office with a case file spread across her desk and her black notebook open beside it, and she did something she had been avoiding for 8 days. She thought carefully about what was actually happening, without the protective filter of clinical language. Mr. Linden knew things he should not know. He knew them consistently, specifically, and without apparent effort. He was not guessing. He was not reading cues. Or if he was reading cues that did not exist in any physical space she could identify. He had described her dream. He had known her daughter's nickname. He had reached, somehow, into the part of her she kept locked and named what was there. There were 3 possibilities. The first, he was a very skilled manipulator who had somehow researched her thoroughly before their first meeting and was deploying that information with theatrical precision. This would require resources and preparation she couldn't account for, but it was possible. The second, he was experiencing a form of delusional confabulation so sophisticated that it reliably produced accurate information through chance and pattern matching. This was theoretically possible and practically absurd. The third possibility she wrote down and then stared at for a long time. What if he is simply telling the truth about what he sees? She had built a career on the premise that the mind was a closed system, that what went on inside one person's skull was inaccessible to another except through the imperfect medium of language and expression. It was a foundational assumption of her entire field. But she was a scientist before she was anything else. And a scientist, when confronted with data that does not fit the model, does not discard the data. She revises a model. She closed the file. She opened her laptop. She began to search, without knowing exactly what she was searching for, in the journals and case studies and fringe literature that she had spent her career dismissing. She was still reading at 4 a.m. when her phone rang. It was a night nurse on Ward C. Mr. Linden, the nurse said, had asked, very politely, whether Dr. Voss was still in the building. He had a message for her, if she was. Mara's mouth went dry. "What message?" she asked. The nurse sounded puzzled. "He said to tell you, you're asking the right questions now. He said you'd know what that meant." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 5, The Room. She went back to room 4 at 4:17 a.m. She told herself she was going because it was a professional thing to do. She told herself this with the same conviction she had once used to tell herself other comfortable untruths, and she believed it about as much. He was sitting up in bed in the dark, perfectly awake, as though he had been expecting her for hours. Perhaps he had. "Sit down, Dr. Voss," he said. She sat today. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence in room 4 was different at 4 a.m., not heavy, not oppressive, but enormous. The way open sky is enormous, the way you sometimes feel the edge of the ocean, that there is simply more of the world than you had accounted for. "I'm going to ask you something," Mara said, "and I need you to answer me honestly." "I have only ever been honest with you," he said. "I know." She folded her hands. "What is this? What is actually happening in this room?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, considering. "You've spent your life studying the rooms inside people," he finally said. "The private architecture of thought and feeling and memory. You've learned to walk through those rooms carefully, respectfully, because you understand how fragile they are, how much it costs a person to let someone else inside. Yes, she said. I don't study them. I always have. I don't know why. I've spent a long time trying to understand it, and the closest I can come is this. Most people move through the world behind glass. They see each other, but there's always a glass between. For me, there's no glass. He paused. It's not always a gift. You should know that. It sounds like it would be very lonely, Mara said quietly. Something moved across his face. Surprise, she thought, as though he hadn't expected her to say that. Yes, he said. It is. They sat in the quiet for a while longer. What do you need from me? She asked. Not what the hospital needs. What do you need? He looked at her, and for the first time in 10 days, he looked like a person who was tired, a person who had been carrying something for a very long time and had almost forgotten that it was heavy. To be seen, he said simply, not studied, not diagnosed, just seen. Mara thought about being 17, about standing outside a locked door and pressing her ear to the wood and not being able to hear anything, and not being able to help, and not knowing yet that she would spend the rest of her life learning how to open locks. I can do that, she said. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 6. The Right Question. He told her his story over the next 3 nights. It was not the story of a man who was broken. It was the story of a man who perceived the world differently from everyone around him and had spent decades navigating that difference, sometimes gracefully, sometimes not. He had learned, over many years, to be careful, to offer only what people could receive, to hold the rest of it quietly inside. He had come to the city because something had drawn him here. He couldn't explain it better than that. A pull, like the feeling before a storm, or the way a room changes when someone enters who is about to say something important. He had followed it, the way he always followed these things, and he had ended up in an empty train station, and then he had ended up here. Hey, he said one night, meaning room 4, meaning her. Mara was writing in her black notebook. She had stopped writing in the clinical file. You said you were waiting for someone who was ready to ask the right question, she said. What's the right question? He looked at her for a long moment. You already asked it, he said. On night 10, 4 in the morning. She thought back. What do you need? Not what are you? Not how do you do it? Not prove it. What do you need? Most people, he said, when they encounter something they can't explain, try to take it apart. They want to understand the mechanism. They want to know how. It's a reasonable impulse. It's how science works. But some things, some people, can't be understood that way. You have to approach them differently. You have to ask what they need instead of what they are. That's what you were waiting for, Mara said. That's what I'm always waiting for, he said quietly. Someone who asks the human question instead of the scientific one. In 43 years, you're the 3rd. She thought about that number for a long time afterward. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 7. After Mr. Linden was discharged on a Tuesday morning in December, 3.5 weeks after his admission. The paperwork was handled by a social worker. The official notes described him as a patient who had presented with dissociative amnesia, made significant progress, and been released into the care of a community support network. These notes were accurate in the way that maps are accurate. They described the shape of something without conveying what it felt like to stand in it. Mara walked him to the door. They stood on the hospital steps in the cold air, and she handed him a card with her personal number on it, and she told him to use it if he needed anything. He looked at the card for a moment, then at her. Your mother is going to be all right, he said. In case you were wondering, the news next week will be better than you expect. She didn't ask how he knew. She had stopped asking that. Thank you, she said instead. He nodded once, and turned, and walked down the steps and along the gray December street until she couldn't see him anymore. Back in her office, she opened her black notebook to a fresh page. She sat for a long time looking at the blankness of it, all that white space, waiting. Then she wrote, The question is not, what is this person? The question is, what do they need? These are different questions. The second one is harder. It requires you to set down your curiosity and pick up your humanity instead. But the second one is the only one that leads anywhere worth going. She closed the notebook. Outside her window, the city moved through its ordinary Tuesday. People walking to ordinary places, thinking ordinary thoughts, the glass between them so familiar they had long since stopped noticing it was there. Mara noticed. She had always noticed. She thought it might be why she had become a doctor of the mind, in the end. Not to understand the glass, not to study it, or measure it, or build theories about its composition. Simply to know it was there, and now and then to find the door. End. No Man's Land. An action-adventure story. 40 miles behind enemy lines. One soldier. No way out. Yet, Chapter 1. The drop. The helicopter was already burning when Sergeant Darose hit the ground. She rolled hard, the way they had drilled it 1,000 times in the red Georgia clay. Tuck your chin. Take it on your shoulder. Let the momentum carry you. And came up on one knee with her rifle raised, scanning the tree line, her ears ringing from the explosion and her left arm bleeding from something she had not yet had time to feel. The aircraft had gone down fast. One moment they were 40 feet up, the rotors screaming against a thermal the pilot hadn't seen coming, and then there was a crack like the sky splitting open and then heat and falling in the hard, indifferent ground. She counted. It was what her first instructor had taught her years ago, a man named Holloway who smelled like coffee and machine oil and spoke in the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who had learned the hard way that haste was the enemy of survival. Count your people. Count your equipment. Count your options. In that order, always. She counted 2 other survivors. Corporal Yemi Addo, 22 years old, from Lagos by way of Birmingham, currently on his hands and knees in the undergrowth being sick, and Lieutenant Priya Khatri, 30, the mission's intelligence officer, who had already pulled herself upright and was pressing a field dressing to a cut above her eye with the focused calm of someone who had decided, as a matter of policy, not to panic. 3 of them, out of 8. Dara looked at the burning wreck of the helicopter and thought about the 5 others and then put that thought in a box and closed the lid. Later, right now, there was work to do. Status, she said. I'm fine, Khatri said immediately, which meant she was hurt but functional. Give me a minute, Addo said, which meant he was scared and trying not to show it, which meant he was also fine. Good. Dara was already moving, putting distance between them and the wreck. Fire drew attention, and attention was the one thing they could not afford. We need to move. Now. That smoke is going to be visible for 10 miles. She did not tell them the other thing, the thing she had calculated in the 3 seconds between the helicopter going down and the ground coming up. Their extraction point was 4 to 2 miles north. They had supplies for 36 hours. They were in the middle of a mountain range that the enemy knew like its own heartbeat. She would tell them when they needed to know. For now, north. 1 foot, then the other, move. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 2. The Mountain. They moved for 4 hours before Khatri's leg gave out. She went down without a sound, just buckled, mid-stride, on a slope of loose shale, and Addo caught her before she could slide. When Dara pulled up the lieutenant's trouser leg, she found what the field dressing over the eye had been distracting her from. A piece of rotor casing the size of a playing card embedded in the muscle of her calf, packed with clotted blood that had been doing the work of keeping her upright for 4 hours through sheer obstinacy. Why didn't you say something? Addo said. Because we needed to move, Khatri said, through her teeth. Dara worked fast and without commentary, the way Holloway had taught her. Clean the wound. Pack it. Bind it tight enough to wake, loose enough not to cost a leg. Khatri made no sound throughout any of this, which was either impressive or concerning, and was probably both. You can walk on it, Dara said when she was done. Slowly, with support. We'll lose maybe 4 hours. 4 hours we don't have, Khatri said. No, Dara agreed. But here's what we have less of. You. That shut the argument down. They made a rough camp in the lee of a boulder field as the light failed. No fire, no light. Cold rations eaten in silence while the temperature dropped and the mountain pressed its darkness down around them. Addo took first watch. Dara lay on the hard ground and looked at the stars through the gaps in the cloud cover and thought about the 4 to 2 miles ahead and the 36 hours they had started with, now down to 28. The math was not good. She had always been honest with herself about math. But math was not the only variable. Khatri had intelligence, literally. She was carrying mission-critical information in her head, Information that had to reach the extraction point regardless of what happened to the bodies delivering it. That changed the calculation. That made stopping not an option. 28 hours. 30 miles to cover once Katri could move at speed again. Possible. Difficult. Possible. Dara closed her eyes. She was asleep in under a minute, the way soldiers learn to sleep, completely, instantly, without sentiment, storing what the next hours would take from her. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 3. Contact. They heard a patrol at first light. Dara was already awake. Had been for 20 minutes. The instinct that sometimes fired before the conscious mind could explain it pulling her out of sleep and into stillness. She had woken Ado with a touch on the shoulder and a finger to her lips, and they had both been watching the eastern ridge when the shapes appeared against the lightening sky. 6 of them, moving in good formation, professional spacing, weapons up. They were sweeping the high ground, which meant they had found a helicopter wreck, which meant they knew survivors had gone north, which meant Dara had approximately 40 seconds before the patrol's arc brought them within sight of the boulder field. She made the calculation in the time it took to exhale. Running was out. Katri couldn't run, and the shale above would give their position away with every step. Fighting 6 trained soldiers with 3 people, one of them wounded, was not a calculation that came out well no matter how many times you ran it, which left one option. Down, she breathed, all the way down. They went flat, Ado pulling Katri down with him, both of them pressing into the shadow of the boulders as Dara arranged herself behind the largest rock and watched the patrol through a gap the size of her hand. The soldiers were good. They moved quietly, checked their angles, didn't bunch up. The lead man had a tracker's way of reading the ground. Slow eyes, nothing missed. He stopped twice on the ridge, and both times Dara's hand tightened on her rifle, and both times he moved on. They passed 40 meters to the east. Nobody breathed for a very long time after that. That's going to happen again, Ado said finally, his voice barely a thread of sound. Yes, Dara said. So what's the plan? Dara looked at the ridge, the slope below, the valley beyond where the morning mist was burning off to reveal a landscape of impossible beauty, steep green valleys and silver rivers, and the kind of wild, indifferent grandeur that didn't care at all whether you lived or died in it. We stopped going north, she said. Both of them looked at her. They are watching the northern routes because that's where a rational person would go. We go east, into the valley. There's a river. If we follow it downstream, we come out 12 miles from the extraction point by a route they won't expect. She paused. It adds time. It adds difficulty. It's still better than walking into a net. How much time? Katri asked. Dara told her. Katri absorbed this. That's cutting it very close. Yes, Dara said. Everything from here is cutting it very close. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 4. The river. The valley was harder than it looked, which Dara had expected. Every valley in a mountain range is harder than it looks. The slopes were thick with undergrowth that grabbed at their boots, and the river, when they reached it, ran fast and cold over a bed of rounded stones that turned under your feet like something alive and hostile. But it was cover. The canopy closed over them. The sound of the water masked their movement. And the river, true to Dara's reading of the terrain, bent east and then northeast in long, looping curves that ate the miles without exposing them to the open ridgelines where the patrols ran. Katri walked, slowly, with Ado's shoulder under her arm, but she walked, and she didn't complain, and somewhere in the second hour she started talking. Quietly, for something to do, the way people talk when silence becomes its own weight. She talked about the intelligence she was carrying. Not the classified detail, not the specifics that had to reach the command post, but the shape of it, the why of it. There were people in the valley they had been sent to find evidence of. Civilian people, caught in something they hadn't chosen. The intelligence mattered because they mattered. That was the whole of it. I keep thinking about them, she said, while we're doing all of this. I keep thinking, we have to get there, not for the mission, for them. Ado said nothing. He was the kind of person who expressed things through what he did rather than what he said, and what he was doing was holding Katri up on a bad leg over slippery rocks in a hostile valley, and that said everything. Dara listened and kept her eyes moving, the water ahead, the bank above, the gaps in the canopy. She had been in situations like this before, though never exactly like this. The geography changed. The enemy changed. The weight of responsibility and the arithmetic of survival stayed remarkably constant. What she had learned, over years, was this: you could not carry the math all the time. You had to put it down between the moments it was needed, or it would crush you. In between the calculations, you just walked. Left foot, right foot, river over stones, green light through leaves. The simple physical fact of still being alive and still moving forward. It was enough. It had to be. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 5, Night 2. They stopped when Katri couldn't go further. It was not a decision so much as a fact. Her leg had stiffened through the afternoon, and by nightfall her jaw was set in a way that Dara recognized as the face of a person. Operating entirely on willpower, with the body's credit exhausted, she lowered her to the ground on the river bank and checked the wound again by feel in the darkness and found it hot to the touch, which was a thing she had been dreading. Infection. Addo said quietly. Early stage. We have antibiotics. It'll hold. She said it with more certainty than she felt, which was a job. She took watch herself and sent Addo to sleep, and sat with her back against a tree and her rifle across her knees and listened to the river and the forest and the ordinary sounds of mountain night. Insects, something moving in the undergrowth far off, the wind through the canopy high above. At some point in the small hours she got the radio working. It had been damaged in the crash. The casing cracked, one of the antenna connectors loose, and she had been nursing it along for 2 days, tightening the connector with the blade of her knife, waiting for the right elevation and the right window. Hey, on the river bank, with a clear shot of the sky to the northeast, she tried again. Static, static, then faint, overlaid with interference, but unmistakably human, a voice. Call sign Bravo, this is Overwatch. We have your beacon. Say status. Over. Dara pressed the transmit button. Kept her voice flat, professional, the way Holloway had taught her. Emotion was information, and information was for her to control. Overwatch. Call sign Bravo. 3 survivors. 1 priority casualty. Mobile. Alternate route via Eastern Valley. ETA extraction plus 14 hours. Over. A pause. The static hummed and crackled. Then, copy, Bravo. Extraction team will hold. Bring them home. Overwatch out. She sat with the radio in her hand for a long time after that. Bring them home. As though it were a simple instruction. As though she hadn't been doing nothing else for 2 days. But she understood the words for what they were. Not an order. An acknowledgement. We see you. We're waiting. Keep going. She kept going. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 6. The Crossing. The river had to be crossed. It narrowed at a bend 12 miles from the extraction point, but narrow was relative. It was still 30 feet of fast, cold, thigh-deep water over unstable stones, and crossing with a wounded soldier and equipment that could not get wet was not a thing Dara was looking forward to. She found a crossing point after an hour of searching, a natural ford where the water spread and shallowed across a gravel bar. Still dangerous. Still cold enough to seize your muscles if you weren't across in under 3 minutes. Here's how we do it, she said. Addo, you go first. Find your footing. Then come back for the lieutenant. I'll cover and cross last. I can make it on my own, Katri said. I know you can. Addo goes first anyway. She looked at them both. Don't rush. Rushing is how people go down. Addo went. He was strong and young, and the water hit him at mid-thigh, and he leaned into the current and moved with a deliberate, planted care of someone who had heard the instruction and understood it. He made the far bank in 2 minutes 15. Turned. Came back. Getting Katri across took everything. The cold water hit her wounded leg like a blade, and she made one short, sharp sound, and then locked it down and kept moving, Addo's arm around her waist, the current pushing sideways and the gravel shifting underfoot and the far bank seeming very far away for a very long time. Then they were across. Dara across alone, the rifle held above her head, the cold swallowing her legs and the current pushing hard and the stones rolling under each careful footfall. She had crossed worse. She kept her eyes on the far bank, and she moved, and she did not rush, and she made it in 1 minute 50. She stood on the far bank and looked back at the river and then at the 2 people huddled together catching their breath and shaking with cold, and she thought, 10 miles, 10 miles, and we are done. Up, she said, not unkindly. We rest when we're out. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 7. The Last Miles. The patrol found them 8 miles out. Not by sight. They heard the soldiers first, moving parallel on a ridge to the west, and Dara pushed them into a drainage ditch, and they lay in 6 inches of cold mud and watched a 4-man team pass 20 meters above them, close enough to hear individual voices, close enough to catch the smell of tobacco from the lead soldier's jacket. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed more than they had to. The patrol passed. They came out of the ditch covered in mud, and Addo had a cut on his forehead from a stone, and Catri's face was the color of old chalk. But they were upright and they were moving, and that was the whole of what mattered. The last 8 miles took 4 hours. They were the longest 4 hours Dara had experienced since a night 3 years ago in a different country on a different hillside that she did not think about unless she had to. She watched their perimeter, and she counted the miles, and she kept them moving. Not fast, but steady, the way water moves downhill, the way the inevitable always moves, without fuss and without stopping. Catri talked less in those last miles. She was saving herself for the walking. Addo also said nothing, but twice he looked at Dara over the lieutenant's head with an expression she recognized, not a question, just an acknowledgement. Still here, still moving. She nodded back both times. Still here. Keep going. They came over a ridge in the gray pre-dawn light and saw the valley below and the 2 vehicles parked in the tree line and the 4 figures standing by them, and Addo made a sound low in his throat that was not quite a word, and Catri stopped walking for just a moment and closed her eyes. Dara kept watching the perimeter. She would watch it until they were in the vehicles. She would watch it until they were moving. Old habit. Holloway's lesson. You're not done until you're done. Don't celebrate the approach. Celebrate the arrival. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Chapter 8. Out. The medics took Catri first, which was right. Addo sat on the hood of the second vehicle and drank water from a bottle someone handed him and stared at the trees they had come out of, as if still not quite believing the distance between himself and them. The cut on his forehead had been cleaned and taped. He looked very young and very tired, and underneath both of those things, like someone who had just discovered something about himself that he hadn't known before and wasn't sure yet what to do with the knowledge. Dara gave her report to the officer in charge, clipped, sequential, factual. The crash, the survivors, the patrols, the route, the river crossing, the patrol and the drainage ditch. She reported it the way you reported these things, without editorializing, without the parts that didn't go into reports. The officer listened and took notes and said, at the end, "Well done, Sergeant." "Thank you, so." She meant it. But what she was thinking about was Holloway, and a training ground in Georgia that smelled like red clay and effort, and a man who had told her once that the most important quality a soldier could have was not courage. Courage was common enough, but the ability to keep making decisions when you were tired and cold and frightened, and the math had stopped working out neatly. Anyone can decide when the options are good, he had said. The job is deciding when they aren't. Catri was loaded into the first vehicle, upright, one of the medics beside her. She caught Dara's eye across the distance and gave a single nod, the kind that meant more than it looked like. Dara nodded back. She climbed into the second vehicle. Addo got in beside her. The doors closed. The engine turned over, and the vehicle began to move, the tree line sliding past the window, the valley falling away behind them. Dara looked at the mountains one last time, at the ridges and the slopes and the hidden river and the 42 miles of terrain that had spent 3 days trying to keep them there. Then she faced forward. The road ahead was clear and straight and led, eventually, somewhere warm. That was enough. End. The Last Cartographer. A fantasy story. She made maps of places that did not exist. Until they did. Chapter 1. The map that should not exist. The first map Sable drew that came true was a village she had never visited, in a valley she had never seen, that did not appear on any chart in the Royal Archive. She was 14. She had drawn it from a dream, the way she drew all her best maps, waking in the blue hour before sunrise with the image still burning behind her eyes and reaching for paper before it could fade. A valley like a cupped hand, a river running through it silver as a vein, a cluster of perhaps 30 buildings, and above them on the eastern ridge, a tower with no door. She had thought nothing of it. She drew hundreds of maps. Her tutor, the elderly Mastercroft, had long since stopped asking where her stranger geographies came from and simply graded them on accuracy of scale and quality of line, which were the things that could be measured. Then a merchant arrived at the academy with a commission. He wanted a route through the Harville Mountains, a passage his family had used for generations. he said, to reach a trading village in the interior. He described a valley like a cupped hand, a silver river, 30 buildings, a tower with no door on the eastern ridge. Sable had found her map in the bottom of a drawer and sat with it for a long time, measuring the impossible against the undeniable. Then she had folded it carefully and said nothing to anyone, because she was 14 and clever and understood already that there were things in this world it was safer to know quietly. Chapter 2. The Guild. 12 years later, Sable Vaughan was the youngest master cartographer in the history of the Royal Geographical Guild, which was an honor that came with a title, a brass medallion, a studio overlooking the harbor, and a set of enemies she had not anticipated and was only slowly learning to count. The guild was old, older than the kingdom it served, older than most of the kingdoms on the maps it produced. It had its own politics and its own hierarchies and its own ancient grudges, and Sable had walked into all of them at once by being young and talented, and the guild's masters whispered this with particular distaste of people confronted by something they cannot categorize. Different. Her maps were different. Everyone agreed on this. The disagreement was about whether different meant better or dangerous. Master Aldrin, who had held the chair of Northern Territories for 30 years and had the eyebrows of a man who had spent those years disapproving of things, put the case plainly at a guild dinner Sable had been unwise enough to attend. A map, he said, to the table at large, in the tone of a man reciting scripture, is a record of what is. It is not a speculation. It is not a wish. It is not an act of imagination. A cartographer who invents geography is not a cartographer. She is a storyteller. And storytellers, he added, glancing at Sable with the precision of a thrown blade, do not belong in the guild. Sable had smiled and said nothing, which he knew infuriated him more than any argument. What she did not say was, I do not invent geography. I find it. There is a difference, and it is the most important difference in the world, and I am still trying to understand what it means. Chapter 3. The Commission. The commission came from the palace on a Tuesday morning in autumn, delivered by a royal messenger who waited in her studio while she read it, which meant it was urgent, and urgent commissions from palace were never simple. The letter was brief. The King's Council required a map of the unwritten lands, the vast territory to the east that appeared on every chart as a blank expanse marked only with a notation here the knowledge of cartographers fails. No explorer who had ventured more than 50 miles into the unwritten lands had returned. No reliable account of what lay within them existed. They were, as far as the guild was concerned, the edge of the world. The council wanted Sable to map them. There was a second letter inside the first, unsealed, in different handwriting. It said only, "We know what your maps are. We know what you can do. That is why we are asking you and not the others. Come to the palace tonight. Come alone." Sable read this twice. Then she burned it in the studio fireplace, thanked the messenger, and spent the rest of the morning standing at her window looking at the harbor with the particular stillness of a person whose life has just changed and who is trying to decide how they feel about that. She went to the palace that night. Chapter 4. The Princess. The woman who had written the second letter was Princess Riva, third daughter of the king, 26 years old, and the only member of the royal family who had ever visited the guild without a formal escort or ceremonial reason. She had come twice, Sable remembered. Once to look at the archive collection of ancient sea charts, and once, on a rainy afternoon 3 years ago, to ask Sable a question that had seemed at the time eccentric and now, in retrospect, seemed like the beginning of all of this. The question had been, do you ever draw places you haven't been? Sable had said yes, because it was true. Riva had nodded slowly and said, I thought so, and left, and Sable had not known what to make of it and had eventually stopped trying. Now, in a small room in the palace's private wing, no servants, no guards, a fire and 2 chairs and a table spread with maps Sable recognized as her own, Riva looked at her directly and said, The unwritten lands are not empty. They are sealed. There is a difference. Sealed by what? Sable asked. By the cartographers who came before, the ones who understood what the guild has forgotten. Riva leaned forward. 300 years ago, the guild produced maps that were not records. They were instructions. They shaped the land instead of describing it. When the old masters understood what they had made, they were terrified. They sealed the unwritten lands, locked them behind a boundary no ordinary cartographer could cross, and rewrote the guild's founding principles to make sure it never happened again. And the maps I make, Sable began. Are the old kind, Reva said. Yes. You've been doing it your whole life without knowing what it was. The valley when you were 14. The coastal passage that appeared 6 months after you charted it. The mountain route that. How do you know about those? Sable said quietly. Reva met her eyes. Because I've been watching for someone like you for 7 years. And because what is locked in the unwritten lands is going to get out eventually, whether we map it properly or not. And if it gets out without a true cartographer to shape it. She stopped. What's in there? Sable asked. The princess was quiet for a moment. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the palace gardens. Everything the old world forgot how to hold, she said finally. Everything that was too large for the maps they had. Magic, old things, creatures that predate the kingdoms, forces that have been pressing against that boundary for 300 years. She paused. The seal is failing. Sable. We have perhaps 1 year before it breaks on its own. If that happens with no map to define what comes through, no cartographer to give it shape and boundary, it will unmake everything. Sable looked at the map spread across the table. Her own work looked back at her. The clean lines, the careful notation, the places she had drawn before they existed. And if I go in, she said, and make the map, then what comes through will come through as you define it. Bounded, named, knowable. Reva's voice was steady. It won't be safe, but it will be survivable. And if I can't do it, then nothing will be safe, Reva said simply, for any of us. Chapter 5. The Boundary. They left before dawn. Sable, Reva, and a guide named Owen who had grown up on the eastern frontier and knew the road to the boundary better than he knew his own face. He was a compact, quiet man of 50 who had the eyes of someone who had looked at a great many things he could not explain and made his peace with the inexplicability of them. He did not ask what was in the unwritten lands. Sable liked him immediately. The journey east took 8 days. The land changed as they rode, the cultivated fields giving way to rougher country, the rougher country giving way to something wilder, and the wilder country giving way, on the 8th morning, to a place that felt like the edge of breath. The boundary was not visible. That was the first thing Sable noticed. She had expected something dramatic, a wall, a shimmer, a line in the earth. What she found instead was a feeling, like the moment before a storm when the air pressure changes and every living thing goes quiet. The horses felt it too. They stopped without being asked and would not go further, however gently Owen coaxed them. On foot from here, he said, and said no more. The 3 of them crossed the boundary on foot in the cool morning light, and Sable felt it pass through her like cold water, a brief, total, cellular awareness that she had moved from one kind of world into another. On the other side, she stopped and opened her satchel and took out a blank sheet of paper. She had packed 40. She had not been sure if that would be enough. She looked up at the landscape before her, vast and strange and deeply, impossibly alive, trembling with the energy of 300 years of contained wildness, and she put her pen to the paper. All right, she thought, show me what you are. Chapter 6. What was inside. The unwritten lands were not what she had expected, which she should have expected, because nothing that mattered ever was. She had expected chaos, wild, formless energy pressing in every direction. What she found instead was something more like a hell breath. 300 years of magic with nowhere to go had not exploded outward. It had organized itself, the way water organizes itself into rivers and currents when it is given enough time and space. It had become a world. There were forests where the trees were made of solidified light, not bright, but deep and amber and warm, like the light inside a lantern, and the leaves chimed softly when the wind moved through them. There were plains where the grass grew upward and also sideways, and the sky above was a color she had no name for, not purple, not silver, something in between that kept shifting as the light changed. There were mountains that breathed, slowly, like sleeping animals. There were rivers that ran uphill and waterfalls that fell upward and lakes that reflected not the sky above, but the sky of some other place entirely, some other world seen through the surface like a window. And there were creatures. She saw them at the edges of things. In the first days, shapes too large and too old for easy looking, moving through the amber forest with the unhurried patience of things that have existed since before the concept of hurry was invented. They watched her. She was certain of that. They watched her the way very old things watch new things, not with hostility, but with a concentrated attention of the deeply curious. She mapped it all. She worked from dawn until the light failed each day, and she worked with a precision and a speed she had never achieved before, because the land seemed to lean toward her pen, seemed to want to be described, the way something that has been nameless for a long time leans toward the first person to offer it a name. She drew the amber forests. She drew the sideways growing plains. She drew the breathing mountains and the uphill rivers. She gave them names from the oldest language she knew, the cartographic notation of the original guild, the words the first maps had used before the guild forgot what maps could do. On the sixth day, one of the creatures came close enough to see. It was not what the old stories described. The old stories said the unwritten lands held monsters. What Sable saw was something the size of a cathedral in the shape of a very old, very large horse, made entirely of dark stone that had somehow learned to move. It walked with a sound like distant thunder and stopped 20 feet from where she sat working, and it lowered its enormous head and looked at her map with what she could only describe as recognition. "I'm naming you," she told it. It was a strange thing to say. She said it anyway. The creature regarded her for a long, still moment. Then it stepped aside and revealed, behind it, what she had been looking for, the source of the pressure, the place where the seal was thinnest, the heart of the unwritten lands. It was a tower. It had no door. On the eastern ridge. She had drawn it when she was 14. Chapter 7. The heart of it. She climbed to the tower alone. Reva had wanted to come. Sable had said no, with more certainty than she usually said anything. And Reva, who was not a person who accepted no easily, had looked at her face and accepted it. Some things you had to do alone. Not because you were braver than other people, but because they were yours. The dream that had shown her this tower 20 years ago had not shown her anyone else inside it, and Sable had learned, by now, to trust the maps. The tower was made of the same stone as the creature, dark, warm, oh beyond measuring. The inside was a single circular room, and the room was full of maps. Not paper maps. The maps were carved into the walls, layer upon layer, 300 years of cartography pressed into the stone by the land itself, a record of what the unwritten lands had been trying to show to someone who could read it. Sable walked the circumference of the room with her hand on the walls and read them the way she read everything, not just the lines, but the intention behind the lines, the question the cartographer had been trying to answer. The question was, how do we come through without breaking what is already there? The answer was a map she had to make, not a map of the unwritten lands. That was done, or nearly, a map of the joining, a map of the place where this world and the known world touched, drawn with enough precision and enough care that what came through the gap would come through into something, defined places, known boundaries, names, rather than into emptiness where it could go anywhere and be anything. She sat down on the floor of the tower in the light that came through cracks in the stone, and she opened her satchel, and she took out the last blank sheet of paper, and she began. She drew for a very long time. Chapter 8. The Naming. When she came down from the tower, the light was a deep amber of late afternoon, and Reva and Owen were exactly where she had left them, which told her either that very little time had passed or that they had the discipline not to move, and she suspected it was the latter. She held out the map. Reva took it and studied it in silence for a long time. She was not a cartographer, but she was intelligent, and she had spent 7 years preparing for this, and Sable watched her read the map the way a scholar reads a difficult text, slowly returning to certain passages, working out the implications. This is, Reva began. The boundary remade, Sable said. Not sealed this time. Defined. Everything that comes through will come through at one of 12 named points, each with its own character, its own set of rules. The creatures, the magic, the old forces, they'll have paths. They'll have places that are theirs. And the known world will have names for them, which means people will be able to think about them, and things people can think about are things people can eventually understand. And the tower stays. It's the keystone. As long as the map exists and the tower stands, the boundary holds in the new form. Owen, who had been listening from a respectful distance, said quietly, "What about the creatures? The old things?" Sable looked back at the place where the stone horse had stood. It was gone now. They were all gone, withdrawn into the amber forest, the breathing mountains, the places she had named for them. "They've been waiting 300 years to be seen," she said. "They are patient. They'll come through when they are ready, at the places made for them, in ways the world can receive. She paused. They were never the danger. The danger was the formlessness. Things without names and boundaries are frightening because you can't think about them properly. Now we have names. She looked at her own map, at the 12 gates, the named territories, the careful borders of a new geography, and she felt, for the first time in her life, that she understood what she was. Not a record keeper, not a storyteller, something older than either, something the guild had forgotten and the world had needed and a girl of 14 had been carrying, without knowing it, in her dreams. Chapter 9. After the map, the guild was not pleased. Master Aldrin convened an emergency session and delivered a speech about the proper limits of cartographic practice that lasted 40 minutes and achieved nothing, because a map existed and the boundary had already shifted and the first of the 12 gates had opened, quietly, without drama, in a mountain pass on the eastern frontier, and a flock of birds made entirely of living fire had flown through it at dawn and been seen by 40 people in the valley below, who had variously wept and laughed and dropped to their knees and run, and who had all, without exception, told everyone they knew. The world was changing. The guild could record it or be left behind by it. After 3 weeks of emergency sessions, they chose to record it, which was the right choice and also, in Sable's view, the only choice that had ever been available to them, though she was diplomatic enough not to say so. She was given the chair of Eastern Territories, which had not previously existed because the Eastern Territories had not previously been writable. She accepted it without ceremony and moved her studio to a larger room with better light and spent the following year producing the most detailed maps of the unwritten lands, the written lands, now, that had ever existed. She made 12 more maps that some of things that hadn't existed yet. By autumn, they all had. She stopped being surprised by this. She was not sure she had ever truly been surprised by it. Some things, when you finally understand them, feel less like discoveries and more like remembering, like finding a word for something you've always known but never been able to say. Reva visited the studio on a November afternoon, when the harbor outside the window was gray and the first snow was threatening and the fire was doing its best against the cold. Master Aldrin is retiring, she said, by way of greeting. I know, Sable said, without looking up from her work. The guild will need a new chair of the full council. They'll find someone. They've already found someone. Reva set a letter on the desk. She's being difficult about it. Sable looked at the letter, then at Reva, then out at the harbor, gray and wide and full of ships going to places that were, thanks to someone's maps, a little more noble than they had been before. The map of the Thornwood is not finished, she said. It will still be unfinished tomorrow, Reva said. The council meets this afternoon. Sable put down her pen. She looked at the map spread across the studio, the known world and the newly known world and the spaces between them that was slowly, carefully, being filled in, all those blank spaces becoming named places, all that formless possibility becoming something you could hold in your hands and point to and say, hey, this is here, this is real. She thought about a girl of 14 reaching for paper in the blue hour before sunrise, pulling a dream into the waking world before it could escape. Some things you carry a long time before you understand what they are for. She picked up the letter. She read it. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket and stood and took her cloak from the hook by the door. I'll need the Thornwood map back by evening, she said. It'll be on your desk, Reva said, and smiled. Sable walked out into the gray November afternoon. The city spread around her like a map of itself. Every street a line, every building a landmark, every person a story moving through a world that was, if you knew how to read it, endlessly, inexhaustibly full of things waiting to be named. She walked through it with the eyes of a cartographer. She walked through it like someone who understood, finally and completely, that the most important maps are not the ones that show you where you've been. They are the ones that show you where you are going. End. The Weight of Iron. A tale of curses, choices, and the long road back. He was the greatest paladin the kingdom had ever known. Then he fell. This is a story of what came after. Character record, Cale Dornvale. Class, Oathbreaker Paladin, formerly Oath of Devotion. Race, human. Age, 34. Status, cursed, mark of the broken vow. Last known location, the Ashwood, Eastern Frontier. Wanted BY, The Order of the Radiant Flame, dead or alive. Note, extremely dangerous. Do not engage alone. Gods have turned their faces away. Chapter 1. The Ashwood. The village did not want him there. He could see it in the way the people moved when he walked down the main road, the subtle shift away, the hands that found reason to be elsewhere, the door of the tavern that swung shut 3 seconds before he reached it. He did not blame them. He would have done the same. Once, a man in black armor with a dead god's mark burned into his gauntlet was not the kind of arrival that made people feel safe. His name was Cale Dornvale, and he had been the finest paladin in the Order of the Radiant Flame for 11 years, and he had broken his oath 14 months ago, and the curse had not let him forget a single day of that since. The mark pulsed when he was near holy ground, a deep, bone-level lake, like a wound that couldn't heal. The village had a small temple to the Dawn Mother at its center, and even from the edge of the road he could feel it, the warm light that used to fill him like water fills a cup, now hitting the mark and turning to pain. He turned away from the temple. He had learned, in 14 months, which battles were worth fighting and which were simply suffering for its own sake. He found a stable willing to take his coin if not his company, and he settled his horse and sat in the hay and ate cold bread from his pack, and tried not to think about what he had been and what he was now. He was not very successful at that last part. He never was. Cross swords, cross swords, cross swords. Chapter 2. What he did. People always wanted to know. He had learned that too. They would sidle up to him in taverns or on the road, drawn by the armor and the mark and the story. They could smell on him the way you could smell rain coming, and they would ask, directly or circuitously depending on their courage, what an oath-breaker had done to earn the breaking. The honest answer was, I chose one life over 1,000. The longer answer was this. 14 months ago, the Order had been hunting a necromancer, a brilliant, terrible woman named Suravel who had raised an army of the dead in the eastern provinces and was marching it westward. Cale had tracked her for 6 months. He had learned her patterns, her weaknesses, her supply lines. He had finally cornered her in a village called Myrith, a small place of 200 souls, mostly farmers, who had nothing to do with anything. Sura had known he was coming. She always knew. She had taken the village as a shield, not harming anyone, simply occupying the place, surrounding herself with living people she knew the Paladin of the Radiant Flame would not risk. The Order's orders had been clear. The necromancer had to die. The army of the dead would reach the capital in 3 weeks. Every day she lived, more people died. The math was brutal, and the math was correct, and the Order had made Cale understand the math very thoroughly before he left. Cale had stood on a hill above Myrith in the pre-dawn dark and looked at the village and thought about 200 farmers who had not chosen any of this. Then he had done something no Paladin of the Radiant Flame had done in 200 years. He had walked down the hill alone, without weapons drawn, under a flag of parley, and he had made a deal with a necromancer. Let the village go. In exchange, I will give you 12 hours head start before I resume the hunt. Sura had laughed. Then she had looked at his face and understood that he meant it. Then she had let the village go. She had used the 12 hours well. By the time Cale resumed the hunt, she was 3 provinces away, and it took the Order another 4 months to run her down. 4 months in which her army killed an estimated 600 people who would have lived if Cale had taken Myrith when he had the chance. The Order had not forgiven him. The gods had not forgiven him. Even the Dawn Mother, patient, merciful, the gentlest of the divine, had turned her light away from his prayers and left only silence where her voice had been. What Cale could not decide, in 14 months of trying, was whether he had been right. 600 people against 200. The math said he had been wrong. But the math had never met the farmers of Myrith, had never looked at their faces in the pre-dawn dark, had never had to decide which specific people would pay for a clean strategic calculation. He sat in the hay of the stable in the village he had not been welcomed in and turned the question over for the 10,000th time, and arrived, as he always did, at the same unsatisfying place. I don't know. I still don't know. Chapter 3. The Cleric. Her name was Brother Aldrich, which she explained was a family name she had inherited from a grandfather and kept because she liked the sound of it. She was a cleric of the Wandering God, a minor deity of crossroads and travelers and lostings finding their way home, and she had been following Cale for 3 days before she introduced herself. You're not very hard to track, she said, appearing beside him on the road as if she had always been there. The dead grass, the birds going quiet. The mark puts out something that nature doesn't like. I know, Cale said. He did not stop walking. "I'm not here to fight you," she said, matching his pace easily. She was short and broad-shouldered and had the calm, unhurried manner of someone who spent a great deal of time on roads and had made peace with the length of them. "I'm here because the wandering God sent me." The wandering God can find someone else. Is tried. You're specifically requested. She paused. That's not common, by the way. He is not usually a specifically requested kind of deity. He tends toward the general. The fact that he pointed at you by name is notable. Cale stopped walking. He turned and looked at her for the first time, properly looked the way he used to assess situations, reading the details. Traveling boots worn but well-maintained, a staff of plain wood, a holy symbol at her throat that was a simple circle, a crossroads, carved from dark stone, eyes that were direct and curious and not, he noted, frightened. Most people were at least a little frightened of the mark. What does he want? Cale said, "There's something in the thorn vast," she said. "Old, older than the current gods, maybe older than the kingdoms. It's been sleeping for a very long time, and it's waking up, and when things that old wake up, it's generally not good for anyone." She tilted her head. "He thinks you're the one to deal with it." "Why me? I'm cursed. I have no divine power. My God won't answer my prayers." "Yes," she said, "that's exactly why." He stared at her. "The thing in the thorn vase is old enough that divine power is like a signal fire to it," she explained. "It draws toward holy magic the way a moth draws toward flame. Any cleric, any paladin with an active oath, any blessed warrior, the moment they set foot in the thorn vast, it will know. It will wake fully. It will come for them." She looked at his gauntlet, at the dark pulse of the mark. "But you're the absence of divine power. You're a paladin-shaped hole where God used to be. You can walk into the thorn vast, and it won't feel you coming." "And then what?" he said. "I have no spells, no smite, no lay on hands. Whatever is in there will need to be dealt with through other means," she said simply. "The wandering God says you'll figure it out. He's optimistic about you." "Wonderful," Cale said flatly, but he had started walking again, and she had fallen into step beside him, and neither of them had said anything about him not going. Crossroads, crossroads, crossroads. Chapter 4, The Thorn Vast. The forest began where the road ended and optimism went to die. That was not an official description, but it was the one the locals used, and Cale had heard 3 versions of it from 3 different people in the village, all delivered with a particular emphasis of people who wanted you to understand that they were not being poetic. The thorn vast was old in the way that made other old things look recent. The trees were enormous, not tall so much as vast, spreading outward rather than upward, their roots above the ground like the knuckles of buried giants. The canopy was so thick that the light filtered through in thin green shaft that barely reached the forest floor, and the floor itself was carpeted in a moss so deep and soft it felt like walking on something living. It probably was. Brother Aldrich moved through it with the comfort of a person accustomed to unusual places. She had explained, on the road, that the wandering God's clerics spent a great deal of time in places that were in between things, between kingdoms, between seasons, between the known and the unknown. The thorn vase qualified on all 3 counts. Cale moved through it like what he was, a man in heavy armor who had been trained to fight and was currently very aware that fighting was not going to be the answer to whatever was at the end of this particular road. He had not been in a forest like this since before the Order. He had grown up in hill country, open ground, long sight lines, the kind of landscape where you could see trouble coming. He did not like places where the world pressed close. He did not like not being able to see. "You're thinking about the farmers," Aldrich said, on the second day. He glanced at her. "What?" "You've been quiet in a particular way for 2 days. In my experience, that kind of quiet is usually guilt." She stepped over a root without looking down. "The farmers of Myrith. You saved 200 and spent 14 months counting the 600. How do you know about Myrith?" "The wandering God told me. He also told me something the Order didn't." Cale waited. Suravel was going to die regardless, Aldrich said. She had a condition, a wasting curse from her early experiments. She had 3 months left at most. When the Order finally ran her down, she was already dying. Her army collapsed without her, and the remaining undead were dealt with in 2 weeks. She paused. The 600 who died in those 4 months, that was real, and it was a consequence of your choice. I'm not telling you otherwise. But the Order's projection, that she would have marched to the capital and killed thousands, that was never going to happen. She didn't have enough time left. Cale stopped walking. The forest pressed around him, green and ancient and indifferent to whatever was happening in his chest. They knew, he said. No, Aldrich said. They genuinely didn't know. They believed their own math. But the gods see more than orders do. She stopped beside him. You made the choice you made with the information you had. The choice cost people their lives. That's true, and it will always be true, and you will carry it. But you did not choose wrong because your math was wrong. The Order's math was wrong too. You chose wrong because you made a deal with someone who used the deal to keep killing. She met his eyes. That's a different kind of wrong. It's survivable. He looked at her for a long time. Why is a god telling me this? He said. Because you've been punishing yourself for the wrong crime, she said simply. And we need you thinking clearly for what's ahead. Cross swords, cross sword, cross swords. Chapter 5. The Sleeping Thing. They found it on the 3rd day, in the heart of the thorn vase where the trees were oldest and the light was barely a rumor. It was not what Cale had expected, which he was learning was a consistent feature of this entire journey. He had expected a creature, some vast, ancient monster sleeping in a crater or cave. What he found was more complicated and in its way more frightening. It was a place, a clearing, perfectly circular, perhaps 60 feet across, where no moss grew and no roots intruded and the air was very still. At its center was a stone, a single upright slab, taller than a man, covered in carvings so old they had nearly been worn smooth by time. And from the stone radiated a feeling that Cale recognized even through the deadening of the curse. Power, ancient, vast, and almost awake. What is it? He said quietly. A name, Aldrich said. Her voice was careful. The oldest magic, older than spells, older than gods. When the world was young, the things that lived in it had true names, and their names had power, and some of those names were bound into stone to keep them contained. But names don't sleep forever. She studied the stone from the edge of the clearing. This one has been pressing against its binding for decades, maybe longer. And if it gets free, it doesn't think the way we think. It doesn't want things the way we want things. It's just force, old force, without direction, without mercy, without malice either. It'll unmake whatever it touches simply because unmaking is what it does. She paused. It won't even know it's happening. How do we stop it? Aldrich looked at him. The binding has to be renewed. Someone has to speak the name back into the stone, press it back into the seal with their will and their voice. She hesitated. It requires a sacrifice. Not death, but something given, permanently. What? Whatever you value most, she said. That's how these bindings work. They are not powered by magic. They are powered by cost. The old ones understood that the things worth keeping safe had to be paid for by the things worth giving up. Cale looked at the stone. The carvings pulsed, very slowly, like a heartbeat. He thought about what he valued most. The answer came quickly, and it was not the one he expected. Not his strength, not his skill, not even his life. The thing he valued most, the thing he had been clinging to through 14 months of exile and pain in the cold silence where his God used to be, was the question, the unanswered, unresolved, eternally turning question of whether he had been right in Myrith. The possibility that one day he would find an answer that would make it make sense, that would resolve it cleanly, that would let him lay it down. That was what he was holding on to, the hope of being absolved. He understood, standing at the edge of the oldest clearing in the world, that it was also the thing keeping him from moving forward. Cross swords, cross swords, cross swords. Chapter 6. The Cost. He walked into the clearing alone. Aldrich did not try to stop him. She understood, he thought, without being told. The wandering god had sent her to bring him here, not to do this for him. Some things could only be done by the person who had carried the weight. The air changed as he crossed the threshold, thicker, older, pressing on him with a weight that had nothing to do with armor. The mark on his gauntlet burned, which was strange, because the mark usually burned near holy things, and this was something older than holy. Perhaps it recognized power. Perhaps anything that had once channeled. Divine energy recognized the presence of something that had been doing this since before divinity was invented. He walked to the stone. He put his gauntleted hand against it. The carvings pulsed under his palm. He felt the name beneath them, not as words, but as pressure, as weight, as something very large pressing against a door that was slowly losing the strength to hold. "All right," he said. His voice sounded small in the clearing. He had no idea if it would work. He had no magic, no divine power, no particular qualification for any of this. He had a dead god's mark on his hand and 14 months of guilt and a cleric of a minor crossroads deity who believed in him for reasons he did not entirely follow. It would have to be enough. "I let go of the question," he said. "I don't get to know if I was right. I don't get to find the answer that makes it clean. I made a choice. People died. That's what happened, and that's what it will always have been, and I give up the right to resolve it." He pressed his hand harder against the stone. "That's the cost. Take it." The clearing went very still. Then the stone began to warm under his hand. And then, for the first time in 14 months, something that was not pain moved through the mark on his gauntlet. It was not light. It was not the warmth of the Dawn Mother or the power of his old oath. It was something quieter and stranger, the feeling of a door closing that had been opened too long, of a weight being set down, of something enormous and old pressing against his hand, and then, slowly, like a tide going out, retreating back into the stone where it had slept for centuries. He spoke the name. He did not know how he knew it. It was simply there, rising from some depth he hadn't known he had, shaped by the cost he had paid, carried by the truth of what he had given up. The name was not a word. It was a weight, and he let it pass through him and into the stone, and the stone received it. The carving stopped pulsing. The clearing breathed out. Kale stood with his hand on ancient stone in the oldest forest in the world, and felt, for the first time since Myrith, the silence inside him as something other than punishment. Cross swords, cross swords, cross swords. Chapter 7. The morning after. He slept for 14 hours, which he had not done since before the order. When he woke, Aldrich had a fire going and something hot in a pot that smelled like real food, and the thorn vase around them had changed in a way that was hard to name but impossible to miss, lighter, somehow, as if something that had been holding its breath had finally let go. "Is it done?" he asked. "The binding is renewed," she said. "For how long? Centuries, probably. Long enough that it's someone else's problem." She handed him a bowl. "How do you feel?" He considered the question honestly, which was something he had stopped doing 14 months ago. "Empty," he said, "but not badly empty, like a room that'd been cleared out." He looked at his gauntlet. The mark was still there. It would always be there. That was not how curses worked, but it was quieter than it had been since the day it was given. "I don't have the answer," he said. "I gave it up. I don't know if that was the right choice either." "Do you need to know?" Aldrich asked. He thought about it. "No," he said, and was surprised to find it was true. "Not right now. Maybe not ever." They sat by the fire in the heart of the ancient forest and ate hot food and did not talk for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. "The Order will still want me," Kale said eventually. "Yes." "The Dawn Mother hasn't taken the curse back." "No." "That's between you and her, and it won't be quick." Aldrich looked at him steadily. "But the Wandering God has a message for you if you want it." "I'm listening." He says, "The gods who turned their faces away did so because an oath was broken. But oaths are not the only language the divine speaks. There are other paths back, longer ones, harder ones, the kind that don't come with titles, orders, or bright armor." She paused. "He says the road is the point, not the destination. He would say that is a crossroads god, but in this case he means it." Kale looked at the trees around them, ancient and vast and patient, full of things older than kingdoms, sleeping or waking or somewhere in between, in a world that contained all of it simultaneously. He thought about Myrith. He let himself think about it. The faces, the pre-dawn dark, the 200 people who had gone home. And then he set in the part of him where the question used to live, in the space he had cleared, and he let it rest there without reaching for the resolution that was never going to come. He would carry Myrith for the rest of his life. He would carry the 600 for the rest of his life. That was the truth of it, and no curse and no absolution and no answer was going to change the truth of it, and that was all right. That was what it meant to have been in the world and made choices in it. He picked up his pack. He stood. "Where does the road go from here?" he asked. Aldrich smiled, small and genuine and a little like someone who has been waiting for a particular question. "Wherever it needs to," she said. "That's the nature of roads." Crossroads, crossroads, crossroads. Chapter 8. The Road. They came out of the thorn vase on a gray morning, back to the edge of the world that had roads and villages and people who moved away when they saw the mark. Some of them still moved away. That was all right. Others, the ones who had lived long enough on frontiers and in the edges of things to understand that the world was more complicated than clean categories allowed, looked at the dark-armored man with the dead god's mark and the road-worn cleric of the wandering god and nodded, the way people nod at something they recognized without being able to name. There was more work. There always was, in a world that had ancient sleeping things and ancient forests and curses that needed bearing and choices that needed owning. Kale was not restored. The mark was still the mark. The silence where the Dawn Mother's voice had been was still silence, and the Order's warrants were still warrants. But he was not what he had been in the hay of that stable 14 months ago, turning the same question over for the 10,000th time and finding no bottom to it. He was something else now, not redeemed, not absolved, not fixed. Moving. That was the word. He was moving. The road stretched ahead of them, gray and long and winding through a world full of things that needed doing and people who needed someone willing to do them at cost, without guarantee, without the certainty of being right. He had paid a cost. He would pay more. He was beginning to understand exactly what it meant to walk the path back from where he had been. Not a single act of heroism that wiped the ledger clean. Not a trial survived and a curse lifted and a God's hand on your shoulder and your sin forgiven. Just the road, one foot in front of the other, in a world that needed you to show up for it even when you were not sure you deserved to. Especially when you were not sure you deserved to. Aldrich fell into step beside him. "The wandering god says there's a situation in the Dusk Marsh," she said. "Of course there is. Cursed land. Possibly a ghost. Definitely a grieving family and a problem no one else wants to touch." "When isn't it?" he said, but he had already adjusted his direction toward the east, toward the Dusk Marsh, toward whatever needed doing next. The mark pulsed, quiet and steady, like a second heartbeat. It had stopped feeling only like pain. It had started feeling, also, like a compass. He did not know, yet, where north was. He was learning. End of Book 1. Cale Dornvale returns in The Dusk Marsh Compact. The depth below depth. A story of cosmic horror. The ocean has a floor. Below that floor is something else. It has always been there. It has always been watching. There is a geometry to the deep places that has no name in any human language. We call it depth, but depth implies a bottom. There is no bottom. There is only further. Dr. Yoel Osei. Final entry. Research Station Meridian, 2019. Chapter 1. The Station. The research station sat on the edge of the Mariana Trench like a thought someone had and immediately regretted. It had been built 12 years ago by a consortium of 3 universities and 2 government agencies, whose names changed every few years in ways that made them harder to look up. The official purpose was deep-sea geological survey, studying the tectonic behavior of the trench floor, mapping thermal vent activity, cataloging microbial life in extreme conditions. The funding was generous. The papers produced were numerous and thoroughly uncontroversial. Nobody looked too closely at the secondary research log, which was classified at a level that required 3 separate clearances of access and which contained entries that would have made the peer reviewers of the geological papers very uncomfortable. Dr. Yoel Osei had been the station's lead researcher for 4 years. She was 41, methodical, and possessed of the specific brand of intellectual courage that is less about bravery and more about an inability to leave questions unanswered, which is a different thing entirely and considerably more dangerous.